African American and Hispanic children are the hardest hit. Almost 4 out of 10 black kids live in poverty, while Asian Americans and white children fall below the national average. With us to discuss these new numbers is Dr. Curtis Skinner of the National Center for Children in Poverty at Columbia University. Dr. Skinner, thank you so much for being on Rise America.
Great to be here.
Let's start with the basic. What is the current bureaucratic, if you will, definition of poverty?
Well, the definition of poverty, it's very simply defined. It's basically 3 times a basic food budget, and then they adjust that figure, the income, to account for to purchase 3 times a basic food budget. And then this is adjusted for the size of the family and the composition of the family. That is how many children, older.
So roughly, can you give us what that number would be for a family of 4?
Well, for family, the current threshold, which is for 2012, for a family of 4 with 2 children is a little over $23,000. It's like $23,300 approximately.
Yeah, so when you think about it in real terms, a family struggling to live on that amount of money and to live below that is really startling.
It's almost impossible.
Yeah,
and, very, very low level.
And the number of children that do not meet that threshold is just heartbreaking. Now, while the level of poverty for children, and that's what we want to concentrate our discussion on today, really hasn't changed since the previous year in 2012, right. It still is at sort of a historic high.
It is indeed.
Why is that?
Well, we think it's the lingering repercussions of the Great Recession. This really was the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression back in the 30s. And we're still having these real, very difficult job repercussions. The unemployment rate is still up at 7.3%. We had unemployment rates up to 10% back in the height of the crisis. And, you know, the poverty rate runs very much in tandem with the unemployment rate. So we're still having a lot of families in great distress.
And that sort of leads me to one of the questions I did want to ask you. I'm going to move it up and ask now. Of course, we are in an economic recovery, slow albeit, and some would call it jobless or, you know, very little job. But the stock market has done great, been hitting these all-time highs. Why is that not reflected in our poverty rate?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think the stock market tends to respond to profits, and profits have been robust in the course of this recovery. They've been doing very well. And in fact, sadly, for a lot of companies, a permanent reduction in the labor force, lean production with fewer workers is a good thing. That's good for the bottom line. And
certainly a widening on the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
That's what's happening. It continues to happen.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the real and very concerning effects of poverty, particularly on a child, their future, and their development. Just run through a list of some of those things.
Well, there are quite a few, and they're very well supported by the research literature. We've got a lot of evidence on this. First, kids that grow up poor tend to do a lot worse in school. They do more poorly on cognitive tests. They've got a much lower rate of high school graduation, going on to college. That's one. So the educational outcomes are inferior. There are health outcomes, both mental health and physical health. You see these associations between growing up in poverty with chronic diseases like asthma and diabetes, with chronic hearing and vision problems, with emotional problems, both internal and external, anxiety, depression, acting out, and these also can have this kind of multiple effect on educational achievement. So those are some of the big sources of concern, the big problems with growing up poor.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the introduction to this segment, and that is the disparity, the disproportionate number of black and brown kids that are on this 21%, 2.8% of American children, however, 37.9% of black children, 33.8% of Hispanic, as opposed to 12.3% of white children that are living below the level of poverty. Is this evidence that in our country we still have institutional bias?
Well, I think it's not given the attention it deserves because it's perceived as being a problem, and this is a perception that is not correct, but poverty has been perceived in the past as being a problem, an inner city problem, a problem of isolated rural communities. But the fact is, poverty is mainstream, and poverty has become more mainstream in the course of the Great Recession. So that we see now this big increase in poverty in suburbs. We see an increase in poverty in families with children where the parent has some college education, where they got married parents and they're both there in the household. You see this very, very large increases in what one would think would be, middle-class families. So poverty has become much more into the mainstream, and I think the word needs to get out that first, numerically, the largest number of children that are poor are white. The incidence of poverty, of course, is much greater for Hispanics and African Americans, but it's a problem that affects everybody.
It's such a disturbing trend, particularly in such a wealthy and powerful country.
Absolutely.
Curtis Skinner, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you are watching Arise America.